Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to History Hack. It is I, the lovely Kit Chapman, and I am joined by the even lovelier Alina. Alina, who is our guest today and what are we talking about?
Oh, you are such a charmer. I love recording with you. You just bring out the light in me and the happiness. Right, so our guest is just as lovely as the two of us, clearly. We have David Schroeder, who's a historian and host of the weekly Cold War channel on YouTube. He's here to talk to us about the notion of what is the Cold War. We're going to do lots of chatting, lots of randomness. You're going to do some science stuff, which I'm going to sit to the side and cower in the corner because I have no freaking clue what we're talking about. David, how are you?
I'm doing excellent, and thank you very much for having me on. I'm excited to be here. You guys actually helped get me through pandemic.
Really?
So what was several years ago at this point, believe it or not. But that's not able to go anywhere except walk my dogs, and it was always History Hack to keep me company. It was fantastic. So thank you very much for
They
that.
still haven't let me go. Please, someone send help. I'm stuck here.
It's waving that little white flag. Save me, save me.
I'll leave that one to Alina to address. So that's
Everyone's accusing me of kidnapping people, so I'm like the wrong person to be talking here. By the way, please don't take that as actual fact. I'm not kidnapping people. Someone reports me to the police or something. So, do you know what? I was going to ask a really stupid question because before we started recording, I just wanted to poke you a little bit with a long stick. And that's my joy. That brings me so much joy. And this question is, who were the bad guys? Were the Russians the bad guys? Were the Americans? Who were the bad guys?
In a true historian answer, everyone was the bad guy. No one was the bad guy. It depends who you are, who the
Polish
bad
people.
guy was.
Polish people.
Well,
Polish perspective.
If you were Polish, then the Russians were the bad guys. Maybe not even the Soviets, but the Russians were always the bad guys because that's a natural state of being, it would seem, for everyone who lives in everyone who's Polish. But I mean, it is a bit of a jokey question, but I mean, it really does elicit a pretty good response. Everyone could be the bad guy, everyone could be the good guy. It all depends on what chair that you're sitting in. If you're part of an NVA soldier in North Vietnam, then the Russians are probably pretty much the good guys, and the Americans aren't. If you're in the U.S., if you're in part of the U.S. military complex and you're stationed in Berlin, absolutely the Soviets are the bad guys. It's all a question of perspective. Like anything in history, it's always a question of perspective.
Well, starting with perspective, I mean, the first question that's sort of written down, we did a little bit of prep, is what was the Cold War? I'm going to shake that up a little bit. When did the Cold War actually start?
Yeah, that's
question.
That is such a loaded question. I mean, you can put 10 historians into a room and you can ask that question, and I mean, you can come up with 15 different answers because that's obviously the way that this is the way the profession works. There are people who make the argument that the Cold War started as early as 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. There's a case to be made for it. I personally don't buy into that necessarily. I think that both sides need to be aware that there's a war going on for it to really be a war. A lot of people use 1945 sort of as with the end of the Second World War as sort of that period. There's an argument to be made certainly for multiple years that happened prior to that. We for the channel anyways, we conveniently use 1945 just because it's a nice clean breaking point. We obviously go further, like earlier into the past, to address certain subjects and give background. Lots of people will give 1947, 1948 as starting points. 1947 does seem to be a really sort of a common sort of acknowledgement that that's really where it is. I would like to make a pretty strong contention that you could almost go as late as 1950 with NSC 68 document coming out from the White House, and the start of the Korean War. I think that's to me that's I don't ever see dates going any later than 1950. But I mean that's a pretty wide range from 1917 to 1950, with numerous different compelling arguments to be made for any point in between there as well. And then, of course, the follow-on question, I'm going to jump right to it, Kitten, to cut you off. When did it end? And there's people that are going to say 1980, as early as 1987, with Gorbachev's pledge of non-interference in the Warsaw Pact nations. 1989 is often used as a sort of that key mark.
Berlin Wall kind of era.
With the Berlin Wall, like, you know, it's like the semi-free elections in Poland. Can't forget about those, Alina. Follow the Berlin Wall and sort of the end of the acknowledged end of communism across the Eastern Bloc. 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it could be December when the flag actually comes down, but there's a case to be made for the coup, the August coup that tried and failed almost comically to overthrow Gorbachev. And of course, then there's the more conspiratorial notion out there that the Cold War never ended and it's been waged secretly all this time, and it's now just re-emerging today in the present.
I was going to say, I wouldn't say secretly at all.
Exactly. I was thinking exactly the same thing. It's still open. I mean, come on.
That's well, and there's a vague case to be made for that. I personally don't believe that. I think that with any kind of historical event, you can always link, like, is the Second World War just a continuation of the first?
Do you know what I was about to say that? So Alex and I have a lean at Alex off occasionally, and she constantly will wind me up and say, "Oh well, you know, your Second World War is total bullshit because it's just a continuation of the First World War." I can see the arguments for it, but I also agree with you. There has to be kind of like a bit of a stopping point and a continuation of other events. It's kind of just layered one on top of the other. So no, there was a Second World War and there was a First World War. Whoever thinks that, get the fuck out.
That's so based on that definitive answer. Yes, there is a period of the Cold War. We may be entering into a second Cold War. Hopefully, we collectively come up with a better name than just Cold War II. Because let's get something snappy going out there. I'll leave that to you guys to come up with, but that would be nice just to do that. But I think, yeah, that's 1991 is typically sort of that the latest date that we ever really see being bandied about is in terms of for the end of the first Cold War, anyways, before the onset of the crazy 90s. So that's.
Well, diving straight in there, and I know we're kind of doing things backwards because we're talking a little bit about the end, but I want to help out some students, because I know that in the international baccalaureate, yep, one of the questions is, what is the reason that the Cold War ended? Is it the collapse of the Soviet Union? Is it something that the US did? So let's talk about the reasons this became a Cold War and the reasons that it ended being a Cold War.
Poland. Okay, sorry, I'll mute myself back again.
Why did the Cold War end is an incredibly complicated question, because there's no, like anything, there's no one single factor. It's a multitude of different threads that all sort of came together at the right time in the right place and all sort of happened in the right order and resulted finally in that final action in December 26, 1991, with the Soviet flag being lowered over the Kremlin. Why, like, where did that demise begin? I mean, there are people that are going to go back to 1917 and the Bolshevik Revolution. That they're going to go to that. Other people will pick Stalin, like the rise of Stalin that was the first nail in the coffin. I think there's a very compelling reason that's being put forward recently, that it was the oil shocks in the 70s and the fluctuations in oil pricing, with the massive spikes in oil, the price of oil, that allowed the Soviet Union to increase its spending. And then with the subsequent roll-off of oil pricing, it had to reduce all of its transfers to its allies, including places like energy transfers to places like Poland. And based on those budgetary shortfalls, it caused all kinds of ripple effects in society and like basically individual communities, whether they were in East Germany, in Poland, Hungary, within the constituent republics within Russia itself began to really see the hollowness of the system, and that sort of combined with a variety of other things, all eventually ended up in the collapse. It also required a leader like Gorbachev in Moscow who wasn't willing to use extreme force to suppress and repress and keep people in line, so to say. And there's going to be arguments against that because of massacres that happened in the Baltic states and in Georgia and a couple of places in the dying days of the Soviet Union. But largely, like, is there one cause that brought about the end of the Soviet Union or the end of and subsequently the end of the Cold War? No, there's not one reason. It's a whole multitude of different reasons that all came together: cultural, political, military, all sort of acting together in concert, that came together in just the right way.
So if it's all kinds of things just happening at once, let's actually just put the sides into perspective, because one of the key things is people always bring up the ideology. There's the Soviet ideology. There is the closed society, if you like, if you want to go into the philosophy, and then there's the open society of America. And people always talk about that. But are these blocks that different, the West and the East, or is it just imperialism reborn for the 20th century?
I'll be honest, I'm very much a proponent of the idea that they're two. Did they start this way? No, but did they end up this way? It's very much two empires, with different formats of empire, but very much two empires striving for control. And it's not an empire like sort of in the British sense, where there's the monarch sitting and there's direct control over 25% of the crown, and the sun never sets on the flag and all those things. Instead, it's much more this neo-colonial is a term that's sort of gone to the wayside, and I can't think of just off the top of my head, I can't think of the actual the new expression that I'm supposed to be using that's a much more accurate expression, but it's a form of almost like soft imperialism, where there's economic and cultural control that's happening like through advisors, and there's still national independence in the quote unquote new colonies. But they're very much heavily influenced by the power that are coming from one of the two superpower blocks. And I think I'm not even say by the end, certainly by the 50s and especially into the 60s, you're already seeing that type of relationship assert itself. Whether it's the United States' influence in places like Taiwan, South Korea, those are the two really big ones. South Vietnam, obviously, and that's a whole South Vietnam, like the whole Vietnam struggle is a whole other thing yet again. But then you have the Soviets using their own. They have much more direct control in places in Eastern Europe, like Poland or Bulgaria, Romania. Less so in Romania at varying times. But within that, there's still a degree of national independence, but there's definitely more control coming from Moscow. But then you have the attempts at influence more directly in places like Afghanistan later on in the late 70s, and then places like the colonial decolonization process, where the Soviets are trying to extend their influence military, politically, economically in places like Egypt, certainly in places like Ghana, the Congo, back and forth. There's lots of different influences that are happening. They're trying to constantly get a foothold in Indonesia, promoting themselves as being pro-independence, but certainly trying to gain their own influence and impact there. So,
well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because if you asked anyone where did the Cold War happen, they would probably talk about Vietnam, maybe. They would certainly talk about Korea. They would definitely talk about the Iron Curtain. Africa is probably not somewhere they would mention. So what's going on in Africa during the Cold War?
There's tons going on in Africa. I mean, Africa is one of the absolute hotbeds of the Cold War. So the Cold War, the expression Cold War really is a misnomer. It's a Cold War in a place like in Europe and in North America. And it's the idea that there's a war being fought without any real blood being shed, except that's, well, I think you guys let me know that I can swear a little bit. That's absolute. The fact, the idea that the Cold War is bloodless. It is in certain places, but everywhere else in the world, the notion that it's bloodless is absolute bullshit. Because you've got constant, like there's civil wars and border wars, low-grade wars, a couple of much bigger wars that are happening across South America, Africa, and all across Asia. The estimates of the number of people that have died in conflicts through the Cold War is upwards of 15 to 20. This is in direct conflicts, is 15 to 20 million. And that includes places like Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, the Iran-Iraq War through the 80s, Congo, Nigeria. The list goes on and on. Angola, Mozambique, and those. As soon as you get into Africa, that starts turning into these. These are much more. They're low intense. They tend to be low intensity wars, guerrilla warfare. It's warfare that is very much driven by nationalism. It's national struggles of independence, of freedom. And what ends up happening is that you get these two ideological superpowers in the United States or in the Soviet Union that are stepping in and providing support to like a group of rebels or freedom fighters, depending, again, coming back to your perspective, what side you're actually on. And they're coming in, they're providing support. And in exchange for that support, that group that's receiving the support is pledging their support in exchange for being a Marxist group. They're a pro-Soviet group.
So this is proxy war then?
It is 100%. Absolute 100% proxy war. But what you end up getting is Marxist rebels that are that are fighting in Angola or Mozambique, for example. And it's a national struggle. It's a nationalist struggle, which doesn't really jive with the whole idea of the fading away of nationalism from actual Marxist-Leninist philosophy. Marxism certainly, but then you get this weird ideology that gets bolted on top of a nationalist struggle to give a veneer that the Cold War is actually an ideological struggle. The Cold War was probably it's ideological in name and very much imperial and nationalistic in nature. That's very much the undercurrent that you see throughout the period in terms of how the war is actually being fought outside of Europe and North America.
Well, let's just continue with that theme, because there are two questions that emerge first and foremost. The first is that all of the countries you've just mentioned are ex-colonial countries. They've just shaken off the imperialism of either Britain or France or Germany, or some European power. And we're seeing groups automatically sort of almost flocking to another neo-imperialist kind of support. So that's kind of interesting. Sort of, is that something that people are aware of? And as a follow-up to that, is this just lip service? Are people just wanting to get into power and they are pretending to be Marxist or pretending to be capitalist?
In terms of that second question, Kit, yeah, absolutely. This is my opinion, and like anything, there's a good contention to be made on both sides. I very much see it as people realizing what the avenue to power is. They may have a base belief in it, but at the end of the day, it's very much about like taking your own group and putting themselves into a power position, and making sure that they can hold on to and maintain that power. And it's interesting because in places like in Africa and in certain places across Asia, you see things breaking down across ethnic lines, whether it's ethnic tribal lines or clan lines, depending what society that you're talking about. But it's not that that one particular group is going to be exclusively Marxist-Leninist in their belief. It's very much, ideology doesn't work that way. It's very much that these things break down along clan lines, and it's about power brokering, power sharing. It's like usurping power, whatever that happens to be. So that's certainly how I would address the second question. And I got going there, and I've forgotten what the first half of your question was there, Kit. So.
The first half of the question was regarding shaking off pre-imperialism. So, these are all ex-colonies that are just finding their feet.
I think a lot of that has to do with the struggle of decolonization, where, there may be hundreds of years of economic and political structures that are fought against over, it's like it could be a 5-year period, a decade, 2 decades, whatever that happens to be. And it could be done through peaceful means, like it was done in Ghana, formerly Gold Coast. And it could be a much more violent struggle than like something like that happened in across the former Portuguese African Empire in places like Angola. But suddenly, it's like there's this struggle that happens, and then you're independent. And as an independent nation, all of those structures that your society and that has been built around maybe not be completely gone, but certainly as a new independent nation looking to distance themselves from the former imperial master. So there's an effort to try to shake things up, and that often causes a lot of economic hardship and a lot of economic problems in terms of that shakeup as things are being realigned. And anytime that you see an economic shakeup like that, it's very, very common to see political powers start to shift as well. Hardship, economic stability doesn't tend to cause a ton of, this is a broad statement and I'm going to have people yell at me about this, but economic stability doesn't tend to create a ton of really tumultuous political instability. Economic instability absolutely leads to political instability, as new lines get drawn in the sand and people start trying to gain advantages over others. So
I think it's very telling. I mean, if anyone doubts that, look at the flag of Mozambique, which is an AK-47, a hoe, and a cogwheel. I mean, it's about economics and it's about power.
100%. That's and Mozambique and Angola are in the English-speaking world certainly are very much overlooked wars of decolonization that went on for decades. The actual War of Independence could have been relatively short, but then civil wars that erupt afterwards, because groups that had a common alliance, disparate groups that had a common alliance to overthrow the colonial leader, suddenly the colonial master is kicked out, and now those groups that are still there are now fighting for the power amongst themselves, and that's where you start seeing different support coming in from the United States, coming from the Soviet Union, or via proxies. Cuba had combat troops on the ground in Angola. And I think that that's something that people may be aware sort of in the back of their heads, but it's actually really easy to forget just the extent of Cuba's proxy war. We always, in my mind anyways, I always think of Cuba. Well, Cuba was this Caribbean satellite state of the USSR. Except that Cuba was also doing its own thing and sending its own combat troops overseas, and getting itself involved because it didn't think the Soviet Union was necessarily doing enough to promote national independence, national liberation struggles. So it turns into this proxy wars. It's really quite interesting to see how all that breaks down and breaks out. So
I'm going to jump in before Kit starts speaking. So I want to change the conversation a little bit more towards the East, especially talking about something that's really important now, like right now, and that's the idea of China and Taiwan. I literally just recorded 2 long hours with Jonathan Clements talking about Taiwan, talking about modern day politics and obviously the history. But it's also, Taiwan is really important during the Cold War at this point. And all of these it's like this ripple effect that goes back hundreds of years, and it just continues over and over and over. And there's also quite a bit of a breaking point in the Cold War. And it also becomes important, especially in 1949, because it's where all the Chinese officials kind of escape to before they move on a little bit more. So how important is Taiwan, especially in the modern day context?
Taiwan's a really interesting case through the Cold War, and it's, I think I think sitting here in 2023 and looking back, for a long time, I think it's pretty easy to forget that for many decades at least several decades of the Cold War period, Taiwan actually held what we think of as Taiwan, the Republic of China, held the Security Council seat in the United Nations. It held a veto. Not Beijing. It was Taipei that held that veto. The Korean War only happened because the Soviet Union. The Korean War only happened the way that it did because the Soviet Union walked out of the Security Council while a surprise vote was being conducted. And the Soviets were protesting the fact that it wasn't Beijing that was represented on the Security Council. It was actually the Republic of Taiwan. There's 2 different strands of communism that are occurring between Moscow and Beijing. And again, in the West, this can sometimes be overlooked. This idea that monolithic communism is the expression that keeps getting bandied around, and it's really easy and it's convenient for policymakers through the Cold War to think of, and I'm looking at Washington specifically, but it's very convenient to think of monolithic communism, that Moscow and Beijing obviously are walking in lockstep because they're all communist, except that after 1960, they absolutely hated each other because Mao thought that Khrushchev was effeminate and not aggressive enough. Khrushchev, who put missiles into Cuba and for 13 days everyone thought that was going to break up the world. He wasn't aggressive enough. Mao was all in terms of pressing the button and destroying the world in terms of advancing global revolution. So China ends up then from 1960 onwards being very much separated from the Soviet Union and isolated on the global stage in a lot of different ways. China's doing its own thing domestically, and that's like the Cultural Revolution, which referring to it as doing your own thing, is it grossly underselling the absolute horror of what the Cultural Revolution was. But by the late 1960s, what you have is a very calculating president in Washington looking to see how he can gain an advantage over Moscow, and he's looking towards Beijing as that avenue to try to gain more of an advantage over Moscow. And so Kissinger and then Nixon go to China and the opening up of China. And that turns into this really big thing, obviously, in the present day, because the rise of China as an economic giant happens that stems out from that American, I don't want to say the American opening, but Nixon going to China and sort of bringing China into, not necessarily into the Western fold, but certainly willing to work with the Americans, willing to be friendlier with the West as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, and it causes this rise of China. It actually leads to Taiwan having to give up the seat in the Security Council, give that to Beijing, and Beijing still continues to hold the seat in the Security Council. That result of looking for a Cold War advantage obviously has very much rewritten what the world looks like today, or it's written what the world looks like today as China as a global player, China certainly as a growth power looking to assert itself more aggressively and more forcefully, certainly in its own region, but also further overseas, whether it's in Africa or whether it's across the Indian Ocean, and throwing lots and lots of money around in lots of different places. So that's China's a really fascinating and very often overlooked theater, but certainly illustrates the idea that it's the butterfly effect. You do one little thing here and it turns into this massive big thing somewhere else, and that China's a great example of that to me. So
we've spoken a little bit about the sort of the, I don't want to say lesser states because that's not quite right, but sort of the smaller players in terms of the Soviet bloc. We've mentioned Cuba, for example. Certainly China at the time was seen as a lesser player than the USSR. But all of this was informed by different factors. So the people that were making decisions, particularly in the early Cold War, did not grow up in the Cold War. They grew up in the previous generation. And so how did previous events, and we started alluding to this right at the start with saying that the Second World War was a continuation of the First World War, how did previous events affect the Cold War as it shaped different countries?
It's a great question. The Cold War doesn't particularly start to form in the way that we think of it as until the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 with the North Korean invasion of the South. Prior to that, there was espionage that was happening. It's where you get the Cambridge Five coming to the fore. There's for anybody who's seen Oppenheimer, there's sort of the Klaus Fuchs, the nuclear trials. HUAC is sort of starting to kick off in the States in terms of, but there's not a real idea of what this Cold War is going to look like. Is it going to be proxy wars? Is it going to be all out war kind of thing? And then Korea happens in 1950. And there's very serious consideration within I'm going to say the U.S. administration, but it's very much General MacArthur sitting in Tokyo. There's very much this streak of this is a full-on war. It's backed by Moscow. We have to use nuclear weapons. And it's at this point that I think the Cold War really starts to take shape in the idea that it's not going to be. The idea is to not fight it as a full-on war, where like conventional, where everyone's throwing everything they've got at each other, similar to how the Second World War is being prosecuted. And instead, it's a decision to keep things to more limited scale wars, much smaller theaters, smaller impacts, terrible impact for the people actually being, bombed out of their homes and whatnot, but not letting things escalate and spill over borders. And I think that's really, there has to be like an effect of politicians who had both directly fought in the First World War, and then certainly were making political decisions through the Second World War. The Second World War had only been over for 5 years when Korea broke out. In a lot of cases, it was a lot of the same senior leadership that was in place. Certainly Stalin was certainly still in place. There's a
This
lot
wasn't
of
just political, though. I mean, MacArthur famously was removed from Korea for his advocacy of going even further. Patton was talking about recruiting former Nazis to defend against the Soviet bloc.
100%. MacArthur's sort of this, and he's sort of the test case in terms of all this, where he's advocating for the use of nuclear weapons. But the politicians, including Truman, are letting him advocate for the use of nuclear weapons. There isn't anybody telling him that he can't do this. MacArthur's removed for not following orders. He's not removed for advocating for the use of nuclear weapons. There was a continued and ongoing debate in terms of what they should do, like how Korea should be prosecuted, how it should be, should it be widened to expand to try to quote unquote liberate China from the Reds. I mean, it's such a hokey thing to say. I sound like a 1950s propaganda film, but it's like to free, it's like to free China from the evil Reds. And to do that, we have to nuke half of Manchuria to do it. But it's at that point that you see somebody like Truman, who actually makes the decision that, no, this is too far, this is too much, this is risking too much. And the sort of the shape that the Cold War is going to take very much happens in Korea with this decision to keep it limited, to not involve, basically not throwing everything in the kitchen sink at the enemy. Maintaining.
Well, that's fascinating, though, isn't it? Because Truman was the guy who dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan.
Absolutely.
And at the time, we're looking at first lightning was 1949. The Soviets had only just started to get nuclear weapons, and first lightning was a copy of the US bomb. It wasn't like, I mean, I know that they were far more developed in their own sense. So this idea of it being a nuclear conflict probably hadn't fully emerged. The Americans were still very much in the ascendancy.
From a nuts and bolts perspective, it was never going to be a back and forth nuclear conflict anyways. The Soviets didn't have enough weapons to nuke. This is a very cold and callous and sort of on paper type of response, but the Soviets didn't have enough nuclear weapons or systems to deliver nuclear weapons than to irradiate more than a few cities. Like they had a very small nuclear arsenal at the time. It took a decade to come close to any kind of parity with the United States, and even then they still lacked delivery systems. They might have had the warheads, but you've got to have the missiles and the bombers to be able to actually deliver the nuclear warhead, or it doesn't really do a whole lot. So the idea that the United States chose to not prosecute it as a nuclear war, that's a conscious decision to not pursue nuclear weapons as a battlefield means. As you say, it is really interesting that Truman made that decision, and I think that's a very much a facet of an evolving and changing view of what the atomic bomb, and then later the hydrogen bomb, what they actually were. At the time that they were actually dropped in 1945, they weren't necessarily thought of as being these life-altering weapons or like world-changing weapons. It was just that they were one single very, very big bomb. that was very much the philosophy that the military looked at them with. And frighteningly enough, there were certain military leaders like Charles LeMay that continued to hold that viewpoint until his death in the 90s. That they were, Dr. Strangelove is a great example of that. But
Edward Teller is the classic Dr. Strangelove, who, as I say,
yeah,
the hydrogen bomb, that's 1952. So it's not that far after the Korean War.
Yeah, that's the Korean War is still going on while the super is being developed, and everything like that. So it really is interesting to see where that there's this starting to this shift in perspective and shift in terms of what the use of nuclear weapons could possibly mean, and all those things that are happening within a really short time. And it's, as you said, and I think it's a really great point to make, that it's the same people that made the decision in the first place that are then they're not walking back their decision, but they're actively choosing not to use them. And it's not out of fear of retaliation. That's a very much a conscious choice to not want to use nuclear weapons. Better realization, a better understanding of in terms of what nuclear weapons are capable of doing and what they actually do to people and to humanity in general.
So we've been talking about pretty much the Cold War happening around the world: China, Africa, Cuba, Korea, Vietnam, all of that. But what about Europe itself? We've completely omitted that in this conversation. Was it possible that they could have turned from a Cold War more to a hot war at all? Was there that
Yes.
chance of that happening?
Yep, absolutely. And there were incidents that happened. 19 what was the date? The 1961 Berlin crisis. Several months after the Berlin Wall had gone up, and at that point it was less of a wall and more just a lot of barbed wire fence. But as the Berlin Wall was being constructed, there were for those who might not know, during the Cold War in Berlin was never administratively part of Germany. It was considered, and throughout the Cold War, it was not throughout the Cold War until the 70s. It was an occupied city. Actually, throughout the Cold War, it was an occupied city, and it was occupied by the four major powers from the occupation at the end of the Second World War. So you had your Soviet sector, your American sector, your British sector, and your French sector. And the uniformed personnel from any of those four occupying powers were free to cross the border into the other's sector, as long as they were properly in uniform and carried proper identification. But most importantly, they needed to be in uniform. They were free to cross, and border guards weren't allowed to stop them. So October 1961, the U.S. head of mission, a man named Alan Leitner, was crossing from West Berlin, the American sector, crossing over to East Berlin because he had tickets to go to the opera. And he was stopped by a border guard and who refused to allow him to cross because Leitner refused to show identification because he didn't need to, because he was in proper uniform. And this egregious action so outraged that General Lucius Clay, look him up. He's a fascinating character. General Lucius Clay decided that this was absolutely an unconscionable act, and with the support of the occupying powers and his occupying governments, including Washington, they rolled tanks up to the border. And the Soviets, of course, saw tanks rolling up, so they responded in kind. And there was a 5-day standoff with Soviet and American tanks, not more than 30, 40, 50 meters away from each other, pointing, barrels down, pointing at each other. And the world really did stand on the brink of potential full-on war between the two. If somebody had an itchy trigger finger, something misfires, anything could have happened. That could have been a full-out war that happened right there. Cooler heads eventually prevailed. Tanks roll back to barracks. Everything sort of calms down. That's sort of considered to be the potentially the hottest moment in Europe at the time. And that was very public. If you go to Google and just Google 1961 Berlin crisis, there's some really amazing and really frightening pictures of Soviet and American tanks barrels down at each other, like facing off across barbed wire. because that's what the Berlin Wall consisted of. And that's sort of one of the high points. The high point might not be the correct word. Low point, let's say. But then there's other incidents that happen like throughout the Cold War that don't ever really get attention. There's like border crossing accidents that happen. There's like weird little alerts. There's accidents that happen. Any of those accidents, without cool heads prevailing, could have turned into a shooting war. That was always the risk. But cooler heads prevailed, training prevailed, like all those things on both sides. I'll certainly add to that. And we all miraculously survived the Cold War. So,
and this is why you don't go to the opera. Like, if you we almost ended the war. So I was actually going to mention this because I was going to give you a list of different little flashpoints during the Cold War and when could it have become hot, and sort of ask you because we're running out of time a little bit. I wanted to give you like a sort of I don't know, 1 out of 10 maybe scale. So is Berlin Crisis the 10 out of 10? That is how close we came.
Berlin Crisis often gets forgotten. I would probably give Berlin Crisis about a 9.
Okay.
Like a 9 out of 10. It was pretty, like both NATO and the Strategic Air Command, which was on 24-hour nuclear alert, like airborne alert. They were both raised their defensive levels in 1961. It one like an accidental misfire and could have been Dr. Strangelove and the B-52s are flying in. So,
well, following straight on from that, 1962, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the absolute closest, definitively, that a conscious decision could have been made to go to convert from a Cold War to a hot war. 1962 is like that. Those 13 days in October are absolutely, in my opinion, that was the closest that we ever came to being consciously eradicated. Because there's been lots of other little incidents and accidents that happened that could have accidentally resulted in us all being incinerated. So,
well, indeed, like people, for example, very cool heads realizing that no, the US are not launching nuclear attacks at us, which leads me to the next one, and I'm sure you know where I'm going with this.
1983, Stanislav Petrov.
Indeed,
the man who saved the world.
The man who saved the world.
Absolutely. 1983, Stanislav Petrov is a lieutenant colonel in one of the strategic missile forces with the Soviet Army. His computer system, which was relatively new at the time, detected a limited early launch coming from the United States, coming from the West. But something, and his orders would be to inform, seek authorization, and fire. That was his. And to launch his battery of missiles. Those were his orders. He didn't think that it seemed right that there was a limited launch, and he refused to follow through on his orders. He was cashiered afterwards, and he lived the rest of his life. He ended his military career that day by doing the right thing, but it didn't make sense. And it turns out at the end of the day that it was the computer system. I think it was picking up. I can't remember if it was a flock of birds or if it was picking up sunrise. Just the sun coming over the horizon.
Red balloons. That was what it was.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. Did result in a fantastic NATO song, so it gave us that at least. But that type of incident wasn't the only incident. There were like several incidents that have been made public since that happened with the U.S. Early detection system. There was somebody loaded a training tape onto the live system at NORAD headquarters at Cheyenne, Colorado. And the training tape obviously simulates a full launch coming from the Soviet Union. And the response could very well have been full launch in retaliation. That 15-minute warning to the U.S. It's only 4-minute warning if you live in the U.K. You've only got 4 minutes if you live in the UK to make a decision what you're going to do, 15 minutes if you live in the US. Not a lot of time when you actually stop and think about what you have to do in that, in that 15 minutes. But cooler heads prevail. Something doesn't make sense. Something doesn't quite jive right. So some people stop and they actually investigate it, and they don't just go to hit the panic button and, turn the keys.
Well, moving away from Matthew Broderick, we're going to go to a more conventional war system. Able Archer, sticking in 1983. What do we think of that?
Able Archer is, because so much of that data or so much of that documentation from Able Archer is still classified, and the Soviet stuff.
Can you just explain what Able Archer is before we go in?
So Able Archer is the specific name for a specific training exercise that was being conducted in, I want to say it was November 1983, where every year the United States ran mission training exercises, something called Reforger, which is Return Forces Germany, where most U.S. there was U.S. garrison troops that were stationed in Western Europe, but most U.S. forces would have been stationed in the United States. And in the event of the balloon going up, 99 of them possibly, hopefully not. The idea was that there was this massive airlift operation that would be conducted, and battalions and divisions of troops would be airlifted from the United States into Germany. And they ran this as a training to meet up with like stationed vehicles and equipment that was left there. And this was an exercise that was run every year. It was being run in October 1983. But what changed with this one is that they were running a nuclear, wasn't a live fire, but they were running a nuclear training exercise attached to the end of it. And what was different about this one is that they were practicing, for the first time, they were practicing radio silence, communication silence, and supposedly they were involving the White House for the first time, which set a whole bunch of alarm bells off in Moscow. And you have Andropov, Yuri Andropov, as the premier at the time, who was in the process of slowly dying, but he was also incredibly paranoid. And with that paranoia, when he's got his intelligence agents, his KGB agents, and GRU, and they're all feeding all this information back to him about what the United States is doing in terms of these training missions. And it's those two things at the end that suddenly that tip off. And he reads that, and there's a lot of the senior leadership in the Soviet military that sort of read this as, well, if they're going to launch like a preemptive strike, this is how they're going to do it. They're going to do it under the guise of a training exercise. Supposedly, the U.S. has absolutely no idea that the Soviets are reacting to this. They think that they're carrying on like it's just a training exercise. The supposition, and there's conflicting data that exists out there as a result of still a ton of classified documents, certainly from the Western side, and a very, very limited to no access on the Soviet side to any of these documents. There's a possibility that the Soviets actually loaded nuclear weapons onto aircraft stationed in East Germany, which, if it did happen, was the only time that it happened during the Cold War. If that is the case, that was as close that we know of. That is as close as the Soviets ever came to pressing the button and launching a nuclear strike first.
I was going to say fantastic. That's probably not the word to use in this particular instance. I'm going to give you one last one, and this is from the realms of fiction, and I just thought I'd have a little bit of fun. Tom Clancy, Red Storm Rising.
Fantastic book.
Could you see that? Is that plausible in your mind?
When I first read it when I was a kid, yeah, absolutely. That's I firmly believe that whether this is good or bad, that Tom Clancy and Microprose video games, for those of us of a certain vintage out there, those are the two things that really sort of sparked my initial interest in the Cold War in the first place, and I really haven't. It's held a place of affection in my heart since. The quick answer to that, I'm gonna work on the assumption that everyone's read the book. It's essentially an American fictional account of how the Third World War would play out.
If you're interested in the Cold War, you've got to have read Red Storm Rising. I mean, it is the classic book.
Absolutely. Do I think that it would have ever played out that way? No, absolutely not, because nuclear weapons would have been used. There were very few U.S. plans that didn't involve at least the use of tactical nuclear weapons to blunt an initial Soviet onslaught. The Americans never had enough garrison, especially after the mid-1960s in Vietnam. The Americans never had enough U.S. Troops on the ground or even Allied troops on the ground to be able to blunt a Soviet offense.
Oh,
The
come
idea
on now.
was
They had Elvis in Germany. Like, Elvis could have stopped at least a couple of divisions.
just would have swung his hips around a couple of times, and the T-55s just fall apart. Yeah, that's this whole idea that the war was going to be fought as a strictly conventional means was never the reality. There was always the plan that there was at least going to be tactical nuclear weapons used to blunt any kind of Soviet offense. And then if one side uses a nuclear weapon, well, the other side has to use a nuclear weapon, and then it just goes back and forth until everything escalates, and then you get, it's full on nuclear war. There's some really interesting passages from Daniel Ellsberg's, I think it was his last major book, The Doomsday Machine, before he passed away. It was written, I think the book was like 2017, 2018, before he passed away last year, or maybe it was earlier this year. Anyways, talking about his time as a nuclear analyst at RAND, and his surprise it was in the early 60s when he made the discovery from talking to Navy and Air Force and even Army personnel that there was no U.S. military plan that involved any kind of limited nuclear offense. It was always red light, green light. It's if peace exists, then no nuclear weapons. If war exists, full launch. That was always the plan.
David, we
Terrified yet?
No, but we could sit and talk about this forever. We've reached time. So we're going to have to get you back on to do a little bit more because we've covered so many different topics today. We've just gone literally on the pendulum, gone from one end to the other. And Kit and I both have our own little agendas here. So I'm pushing mine and Kit pushing his. So we might as well come and join us again and we can do this and have a little bit of fun with the Cold War. Have fun. Can you say that? Have fun with the Cold War? But better than me saying, no, I'm not going to say it live. No, never mind. Moving on. Can you remind our listeners how they can get hold of you, where they can find you?
So I am the host of the weekly channel, the Cold War channel on YouTube. Whether YouTube being the wonderful place that it is, come join us, watch a couple of videos. We've been on the air for 4.5 years now. I think we're coming up to about 300 videos on various different subjects through the Cold War. Come check us out. I read all the comments, even the bad ones. That's a horror show in and of itself. And if anybody needs to shoot me an email, please do. It's thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com.
Yes, all those interesting people you find on YouTube. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me and Kit. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure's been all mine. Thank you very much.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/historyhack or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.